RPGs, role-playing games. The video game version of the genre has been blowing up since the 80s. The idea of playing or acting out a role, I assume, has been around for as long as the imagination itself. I'm sure I'm not alone when I recall making up little storylines as I played with friends as a kid. Some people still do this as adults, like LARPing, live action role-playing, but that is probably a subject for a whole other video. D&D, or Dungeons & Dragons, was the first commercially available RPG released in 1974. It basically just streamlined RPGers' imaginations, providing rules and allowing outcomes to be determined by the roll of a dice, sometimes a 20-sided dice. There is actually a 120-sided dice called Disdaicus Tricontrahedron, which is the largest dice allowed by the laws of mathematics, apparently. Computer text adventure games came out in the mid-70s, originally called Advent, because the file name could only be 6 characters long. It was kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure book, more than an RPG. I mean, I guess you played the role of the main protagonist, if you want to get technical, but I feel like text adventure games spawned a whole other genre of video games unrelated to the modern RPG. I found a game called Akalabeth for the Apple II, released in 1979. The game was kind of a precursor to the Ultima series, and was perhaps right on the border of an adventure game or an RPG. It played more like an adventure game. However, you had stats similar to what you think of as an RPG. You could attack an enemy and fought with a turn-based battle system. The playable character could be a mage or a fighter and had different weapons and items you could use, etc. The earliest RPG in terms of console gaming might have been Dragon Stomper on the Atari 2600 in 1982. The graphics were obviously pretty crude, but all the elements seemed to be in place. You could walk around a map and encounter random enemies. There were items, towns, hit points. It was similar to Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest, depending on what part of the world you live in, for the NES, released in 1986. When I was a kid, way back in the 80s, a friend owned a copy of Dragon Warrior, and I remember going to his house in the mornings and playing a little bit every day before school. That might have actually been the first RPG I ever played, now that I think about it. My personal fave, however, and the first RPG I remember owning and finishing, was none other than Final Fantasy for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Final Fantasy is a Japanese anthology science fantasy media franchise created by Hironbu Sakaguchi and developed and owned by Square Enix. Square Enix used to be 2 different companies back in the day, but merged in April 2003. I remember in my prime SNES playing days, if a game was made by either Square or Enix, it usually meant it was going to be a rad game. So it was a merger made in RPG heaven. The original Final Fantasy was released for Nintendo in North America the summer of 1990, and Nintendo Magazine published a strategy guide for the game in their October issue the same year. I kind of remember playing the game before the release of the strategy guide, but didn't really know what to do. I even recall rapidly tapping the A button during a battle after I selected the commands. I guess I kind of hoped my characters might attack more if the Nintendo knew I was trying that much harder to play or something. After a while, I would get stuck on a hard part or just kind of lose interest and want to play from the start again, but perhaps with different characters. I guess I wasn't alone in this, and maybe Nintendo knew the game was kind of tough for kids, especially in North America, and released a strategy guide in hopes of retaining players who shared my slight dim-wittedness and lack of commitment. Other Nintendo games didn't really ask for that much patience or investment before paying off. Basically, you turn the game on and could beat it in a matter of hours, if not minutes. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, took about 20 hours to do a decent job at finishing, getting most of the items and side quest kind of parts. This, of course, didn't include all the time you spent replaying dungeons because you died. There was a save feature, so you didn't have to marathon the game or anything like that, but unlike modern games, if you died, the game was over. You could restart from where you last saved, but you lost all the items and experience you had just earned. This was probably too much for many little fragile child egos, and I recall myself tossing the cartridge into the closet, swearing the game sucked and I'll never play it again. Despite the difficulty and frustration, I kept playing for some reason. Perhaps it's part of my character to not give up, no matter how minuscule the rewards or frustrating the tasks. Maybe I've always just been a giant nerd. The big game changer for me in the original Final Fantasy was when I figured out you could select all the same character. Final Fantasy starts with a bit of a backstory that I don't think I've ever actually read until I researched this video. If you select a new game, you have to make a party of 4 characters. The options are Fighter, Thief, Black Belt, Black Mage, White Mage, or Red Mage. Each character has different attributes, stats, and abilities. The mages can use magic, the fighter can equip serious armor and swords, the Black Belt hits well without weapons. Pretty typical quest game kind of stuff. The party the game is kind of defaulted to the player is Fighter, Thief, Black Belt, and Red Mage. What I didn't realize for a long time was you could choose all fighters. A fighter is by far the strongest character in the game. True, they can't use magic, but that's what items are for. And you won't even have time to think about it as you are cracking skulls with the strongest swords and armors in the game. With my newfound OP party and strategy guide in hand, I think I knocked out Final Fantasy before my 10th birthday. A few years later, I was endowed with an upgrade to an SNES and was introduced to Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II was also the brainchild of Hironobu Sakaguchi. Many new faces worked on the sequel, however, a few vets hung around like artist Yoshitaka Amano and composer Nobu Uematsu. The first thing I noticed was FF2 didn't seem to be much of a sequel at all. Kind of like if you watched A New Hope and then The Force Awakens back to back. There were a few similarities. White and Black Mages were in the new game, but only as NPCs. Some of the magic spells were the same. It was a turn-based battle system, although in FF2 it was an active battle system. If you walked away because your mum called or something, the enemies kept attacking, and you would probably return to a game over screen. Compared to the original, Final Fantasy II seemed like a whole new game. Not that it was a bad thing. I guess I was expecting pretty much the same game, just a bit better. I was super wrong. Final Fantasy II was way, way, way better, and is actually probably my favorite in the series. I've had a remake of it downloaded on my phone since I first got a smartphone. It's usually my unable to connect to the internet game, and I still play it today. I could make a whole video just about FF2. It had a huge storyline, 11 playable characters, multiple maps, several vehicles, my first introduction to the Chocobo, and what an ending. That was it. RPGs had become a cornerstone of my youth, and I was hooked. At some point in 1992, Square released Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. It was very much a dumbed-down RPG for the entry-level player, and kinda seemed skippable, like an extra credit assignment that wouldn't affect your final grade. Maybe I never really gave it a chance, but for one reason or another, since it wasn't the official sequel to FF2, I let it pass me by. The third game in the series, Final Fantasy III, was released in North America for the SNES April 1994. This was kind of an awkward time in my life as a gamer. I was in junior high or middle school, and it wasn't really cool to play video games. It was especially not cool to play RPG video games. Not that I was cool or anything, but I certainly didn't want to do anything to make my situation worse. I had a chance to rent FF3 with a friend who was more into sports games, but was a good sport about my obsession with RPG games, and we tried it out. Again, it didn't seem like a sequel to the previous game. Sakaguchi was kind of the head honcho as usual, and artist Amano, as well as composer Uematsu, were once again on board. At first, the difference didn't seem as drastic as the previous upgrade from Final Fantasy 1 to 2, but the more I played, the more my mind was blown again. 14 different playable characters, 3 of them being kind of secret characters. Every character had new unique skills. The story didn't just follow the main protagonist, and you played as different characters with many different storylines kind of branching out. The magic system was different, and almost every character could use magic. Tons of neat little secrets. It was like FF2, but way, way, way better again. By the time I finished middle school, I think I had beaten the game 3 times and kind of moved on. Several years passed, and I was about halfway through high school in 1997 when I noticed an ad for a new Final Fantasy game. One thing was terribly wrong with the ad, however. It was for Final Fantasy VII. What? Was I not reading the Roman numerals correctly? I looked again and again. Final Fantasy VII for the Sony PlayStation. This was impossible. How did I miss the release of Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI? Little did I know how wrong I was. Way back in the ancient past, before the internet was really a thing, and to put it one way or another, the world was just kinda what you saw in front of your face. What I or everyone I knew didn't realize was we had been lied to. My favorite game, Final Fantasy II, wasn't number 2 at all. It was actually number 4 in the series. Although Final Fantasy was released for the NES in North America in 1990, it had been available in Japan since 1987. The actual Final Fantasy II game was released on the Famicom only in Japan in 1988, and very much looked like a sequel to the previous Final Fantasy. The real Final Fantasy II was the actual first appearance of a chocobo, and many of the graphics and sound effects were direct imports from the previous release. 2 years later, the actual Final Fantasy III was released, again only in Japan, for the Famicom in 1990, months before even the original game was available for North American gamers. Who knows what actually happened, but from what I've pieced together, by the time a release of the subsequent Final Fantasies for the NES would have been implemented in North America, it would have been after the release of the SNES. Final Fantasy IV, as I'll now refer to it, was already in development, and Nintendo of America didn't want to put anything in the way to distract gamers from the new system. It just made more sense to release FF4 as FF2 in North America and hope no one would notice. Final Fantasy V is a bit of a different story. FF4 did not sell amazingly in North America, and Nintendo was kind of worried the upgrade was a bit too complicated for the non-Japanese gamer. Both Final Fantasy III and V had job systems, which had a bit of a learning curve. Nintendo kind of figured the North American attention span just wouldn't cut it, and most likely they would have another disappointing release on their hands. I did have a chance to try FF5 at some point after emulators became a thing. An emulator is a program on your computer that allows you to play digital versions of Nintendo games, or really any game. FF5 was fun, but wasn't quite mind-blowing or anything. I would argue better than Mystic Quest, so I'm not sure whose decision it was to release that game, but not Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy VI was just kind of more of the same. Rather than try to explain the conundrum to the North American gamer, it would be easier to just kick the can down the road and make it someone else's problem. FF7 was a masterpiece. Most agree it's the best in the series, all things considered, and was the first Final Fantasy game to go 3D. It had something like 150 hours of gameplay. The storyline was captivating, the characters were fun, and all had unique abilities and talents. You could choose pretty much any mix of the characters in your party to customize gameplay. There were tons of hidden secrets. It was kind of like the best parts from all the previous games rolled up into one. A friend had beat me to the punch and got a PlayStation and FF7 before I did. The first time I ever got to play the game was at his house, and my eyes almost shot out of my head. The very next day, I carted my SNES and all my games down to Microplay to try to trade everything for a PlayStation in FF7. The guy working behind the till was offering me about $1 per game, and I don't think he even wanted the SNES. Luckily, I had a plan B. I had worked my ass off at a job the previous summer. To the disapproval of my parents, I cleaned out my savings, and by the end of the week, was playing my own copy of FF7 with a shiny new PlayStation. For about 4 months, all I did was play Final Fantasy VII. Didn't call friends, got behind on my homework, my marks went down at school, didn't matter. This game was amazing, and I had to beat it. There was a remake of FF7 released for the PS4 in April 2020. I haven't played it, but critics have said the remake is more of a reinvention, and in many ways is a different game. The battle system is more similar to Zelda, instead of the classic turn-based system. It takes some getting used to and kind of changes the action from what the classic gamer might expect. Storylines have been extended and character development is more intense. If you are looking to broaden your RPG horizons or trying to get back into gaming, this game could be your gateway drug. If you just want to relive your childhood for a hot minute, you might be better off pulling out your PS1 and playing the original. At some point in 1999, Final Fantasy VIII was released. This was the time in my life that I really embraced music, my band, and the local punk scene. Between practicing, putting on shows, and working 2 jobs to pay for it all, there wasn't a lot of time for RPGs. I did try to play FF8 at some point in the 2000s, but for one reason or another, it never quite became a priority. Over the years, I've thought about trying to get back into the Final Fantasy series. Modern games are quite a bit different than the games from the 90s, and a very steep learning curve for a retro gamer like myself. At the time I made this video, there were seriously almost 100 Final Fantasy releases, including all remakes and offshoots. If I gave an average of 50 hours of playing time per release and played for 12 hours a day, I would be playing Final Fantasy for nearly 2 years straight. But what's the rush? Part of what drew me to RPGs in the first place was the escape from reality. That it's my world that I could dip into whenever I want. The chance to not only imagine, but to play as the hero. Me being the only thing that is standing between the world of good and evil. Again, when I made this video, Final Fantasy XVI has yet to be released, but the trailer and reviews look amazing. It's maybe not only a combo of all the best parts of Final Fantasy over the years, but also all the best parts of all games over the years. At the rate I'm playing new games, the polar ice caps will be long gone by the time I actually play it, but I can still dream. There is more to life than gaming, and one definitely misses some of the best parts of the real world when locked up in their room huddled around a television. Games can be an escape from reality, but shouldn't be a substitution. I've lost count of how many hours I've spent playing video games by this point. I'm obviously not alone, as the video game market brings in hundreds of billions of dollars every year and dwarfs both the music industry and film biz combined. At the same time, there have been huge chunks of my life that I haven't gamed at all. Other priorities have just been more important than playing the latest and greatest. Perhaps it's something I'll pick up again in my later years, or maybe by the time I want to try to get back into modern gaming, I'll be so far behind that there is no way I'll ever catch up. Kind of like a 90-year-old grandma trying to get into IT. Final Fantasy was a milestone in my gaming life. If you weren't around in the 90s and didn't have a chance to play some of the games that started it all, put it on the list. Maybe you'll gain a new appreciation for how far gaming has come.